Hey, this is Philip from Seats & Motor Co. and on today's episode we're going to be showing you a comprehensive guide to setting up the ignition timing on a Classic Mini. Now, setting the timing on your Mini is very important both for drivability, power. It's one of the most determining factors on how the engine runs. Now, it's worth noting that before you set the timing, you want to make sure that the mechanical aspects of your engine are in perfect working condition. This means that your engine itself has good compression, that the timing chain is not loose, and that your valves are adjusted correctly. Once all this is good, then you can move on to timing. The ignition system on a Mini can seem complicated, but we're going to go through every component and show what you need to do to make it running perfectly. Now, because the spark happens at the spark plugs, that's where we'll start. So on the Mini, obviously there's 4 spark plugs. They're located right in the front of the engine, really easy to take out with a 13/16 socket. Just want to pop the ignition cables off here and unscrew them. Now, they shouldn't be too tight when you have them in here. They just need to be tight enough to seal against the engine. I like to just spin them out by hand just to avoid cross-threading. And here we have the spark plug. Now, the way that the spark plug works is that the electricity goes into the tip here, goes through the center of the spark plug and comes out the electrode right at the top. Now, it's always looking for ground, and the grounding strap is right over top because it's threaded into the engine. Now, what happens is, in order to get to ground, it has to jump, and in order to jump, it has to make a spark, and that spark is what ignites your engine air-fuel mixture. The gap in between the electrode and the grounding strap here is what we call the spark plug gap, and that's adjustable. The gap distance in between the electrode and the grounding strap varies depending on the type of ignition system you have and also the state of tune that your engine is in. For a completely standard Mini on a points ignition system, you're going to run somewhere around 25 thousandths gap in between the two. For something that is a electronic ignition system with a coil that gives you more spark, you're going to be able to increase that gap to somewhere around 35, 40, even 50 thousandths. Now, the type of spark plug you use is also very critical. For a stock Mini, you're going to run a BP6ES. If you have a points ignition system, if you have an electronic ignition system, you're going to run a BPR6ES. That's for a completely standard engine. For something that is a bit of a more performance-based engine, maybe you have a cam, higher compression, you're going to run a colder spark plug, which means a BPR7ES in this case, or a BP7ES. For a full-out race engine, it could be an 8 or a 9. The higher the number, the colder the spark plug. So I'm going to go ahead and set the gap on these spark plugs. In my case, because I have an electronic ignition, I'm going to set them to around 40 thou. How we set them is we set them with this. This is a spark plug gap tool. It's like a feeler gauge, and there's all these different numbers around the perimeter and a varying thickness to a ramp here. And what you do is you slide it in between the electrode and the grounding strap, and you just turn it until you feel a resistance. And on this plug, it's showing 35 thousandths. So I'm just going to gently pry it apart a little bit there until I'm getting to around 40 thou. And that's showing 40 thou right there. So I'll go ahead and do that for every spark plug. Reinstall them, make sure that they're clean, make sure that the spark plugs are in good condition. Whenever in doubt, it's always a good idea just to replace the spark plugs. They're cheap enough that it's worth not risking having the spark plug having an internal crack or something in it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Sorry. So apparently, according to David Vizard's Yellow Bible, the most power for an A-series engine is found with a 50 thou spark plug gap. If your ignition system is up for making 50 thousandths of spark plug gap. He also said that you can orient the spark plugs so that where the electrode meets the grounding strap, the open end is facing towards the intake valve, so that when the flame front happens, it is propagating from where the fuel and air just came in to the combustion chamber. And you do this by marking where that is on the spark plug, putting it in, and if it's oriented correctly, you leave it, and if it's not, you add a washer like off of another spark plug to space the spark plug out, or you just put the spark plug in like 180 from where you started the threads. It's very minute, but apparently that can make a difference. Now that the spark plugs have been all gapped and they're in there, we now can pay attention to the spark plug leads. Now the plug leads is what send the electricity from the distributor to the spark plugs. So these are really critical. You need to make sure these are in good condition. You need to make sure that there's no cracks or anything, because then the spark, instead of going through the spark plug, will go to the path of least resistance, which would be a ground next to the engine or something. The spark plug leads are also important because if you have an electronic ignition system, I'm running a Pertronix ignition, it does not work if you have solid copper core leads. They need to be the resistor type, suppressed, sometimes called silicone type. There are two types. It's either a solid wire or sort of a fibrous wire in this case. You want to make sure that they are attached firmly on both ends, both to the spark plug and to the distributor, and that they're in general good condition. Next is the cap and rotor. In order to remove it, what you want to do is just take off the spark plug cables from the engine, and a handy tip, I've marked with zap straps, small zap straps, the plug leads. I put 4 on cylinder 4, 3 on cylinder 3, and so on, so that when I go to put it back in, I can just plug them back in. I don't have to follow the lead path. There are 2 little clips on the cap here. You just take these off, and it should come right out. There you are. So this is the cap. This is what the spark plug leads attach to. And the rotor attached to the distributor here, we can pop that off as well. This is what's attached to the distributor, and this spins around with the engine. The electricity goes through the rotor up to the tip here, and as it's spinning in the cap, the connection point is made in between the cap and the rotor, and that sends the spark from the rotor through the cap into the corresponding lead that then goes to the spark plug. So the cleanliness of the rotor and how it contacts the cap is very important for having a good spark quality. If it's all corroded, or if it's pitted, or if it's worn away, the electricity is going to have a harder time getting to the spark plug. And anytime you have resistance in the system, it just means that the spark that finally reaches the engine is going to be less powerful and less likely to ignite the mixture fully, which makes power. So when we're inspecting these, you want to make sure that the plastic cap here doesn't have any cracks in it. You want to make sure that the electrodes inside, or the connection points, are clean and are not pitted or not worn. You want to make sure that the rotor here has a very clean surface. You can even use a little bit of sandpaper to clean it up. And you want to make sure that there's no cracks or whatnot in the actual rotor itself, because the electricity is always going to look for the path of least resistance. And if there's a crack here, it's going to jump, and instead of going through this whole system here, it's just going to jump to the body or to the engine or whatnot. So when you take off the cap and the rotor, don't be worried about marking it for orientation. The cap only goes onto the distributor one way, as does the rotor. There's a little indent and it'll only click back on. So as long as you have the spark plugs marked as to which cylinder they go to, you can pull it off, take a look, inspect it, and put it right back on. So with these in good condition and cleaned, we can move on to the distributor. If you have a stock distributor that does not have an electronic ignition system like this one does, it'll look something like this. This is a points distributor. It has a cap just in the way that the normal distributor does. Has a rotor right here, but on the inside you'll see these are your points. The way these work is there is a 4-sided cam behind the rotor here, and as the engine rotates, that cam pushes against the points and opens and closes the gap that's right here between these two contact points. Now you need to adjust this gap and make sure that the points are clean. What you do is you put it to the point where it's fully open and you stick a feeler gauge in there. In this case, for this one, it'll be 15 thousandths feeler gauge. Put it in there. If it's smaller or bigger, you adjust it by loosening this lock screw, and the points are allowed to open and close that way, and you set it to about 15 thou. Make sure everything's clean, make sure everything works. These work perfectly fine when they're in good condition. They just require a little bit more maintenance. So if it's at all possible, I always recommend to convert the point system here to an electronic system. They're very inexpensive and they work flawlessly. You'll never have to adjust the points again. So you might be wondering, what is the point of setting the timing? What does the timing actually mean? And the reason we have to set the timing is because when you ignite the air-fuel mixture inside an engine, it's not an explosion, it's actually a burn. It's a very fast burn, but compared to an explosion, it's very slow. This burn takes a little bit of time. Now, because you want the peak cylinder pressure to happen somewhere around 12-15 degrees after top dead center, meaning that the piston has gone up the stroke and is now coming down. You've got peak cylinder pressure after it's coming down. That's got the most leverage on the crankshaft to give you the most power. Because you need it to happen after top dead center, or when the piston has reached the very top, you need to ignite the fuel and air mixture slightly before top dead center, because it takes a little bit of time to ignite the mixture to get to the point of peak pressure. Think about it like starting a fire. You can't just light a campfire on fire and have it be fully in flames. It takes a little bit of time to burn the embers. It's essentially happening the exact same thing inside the engine. Now, because the engine, as it rotates faster and faster and faster, in order to keep that peak cylinder pressure after top dead center, you would need to ignite the mixture sooner and sooner. So they call it before top dead center, after top dead center, or BTDC, ATDC. Before top dead center is described in degrees of crankshaft rotation, meaning that as the crankshaft is turning, the piston is coming up the bore. When it reaches the full top of the bore, right on its way down, this is called 0 degrees. This is at the very top of its compression. Any degree before that point, obviously, is before top dead center. Any degree after is after top dead center. So on most standard mini ignition systems, you're going to be igniting the fuel at idle at around 8 to 12 degrees before top dead center. This will give you the maximum power at low RPMs. At full RPM, meaning around 4,000 RPM or so, they call it, this is full ignition advance, you're going to be igniting it somewhere around 30 to 34 degrees before top dead center, because that has to, the ignition system has to happen earlier, so in order so the flame front can propagate and give you peak cylinder pressure after top dead center, when it has the most leverage against the crankshaft. When you go to set the timing on the engine, you're going to use something called a timing light. Looks like this. And it has 3 components. It has a positive terminal here, a negative terminal, and this little clamp. This clamp goes over top of the cylinder number 1, that's the one nearest to the fan's spark plug lead, just like that. What this does is this takes the signal from when the spark plug fires and gives a strobe light out the end of the gun. So every time this cylinder fires, it's going to send a strobe out of here, which will illuminate whatever we point it at. So what we're going to do is we're going to point it down between the fan and the engine at the crankshaft. There's a pulley there. The pulley has a marker on it, and on the engine side, there's also a set of markers. And where this light flashes, we'll be able to see when that dot aligns with the marker. and where the dot aligns with the marker will tell you at what degree of crankshaft rotation is the ignition system firing. So now we've gone through everything in the ignition system, it's time to actually set the timing. In order to set the timing, we need to have the engine idling with full temperature in it at around 900 to 1000 RPM. So go and fire up the car and get it warmed up. So if your engine is running a vacuum advanced distributor, when you're setting the timing, you want to unplug the vacuum line from the vacuum canister to the engine and plug it on the engine side. That I'll do here. There you go. That's making sure that there's no air leak at the carburetor side. This side can be left open, and now we have no vacuum advance at idle. With the vacuum advance disconnected, the engine is running a little slow. We need to increase the idle speed. I'm just going to adjust the carburetor here. A little bit high. Just going to bring it to around 900 to 1000 RPM. Alright, so the engine is warm now. It's sitting at about 900 RPM, and we have the vacuum line between the vacuum distributor and the intake manifold disconnected, but it's plugged so that there isn't a vacuum leak. Now let's set up the timing line. So, unravel this here. Okay, so we'll take the positive lead and connect it to the positive.
You're stealing power from a known power source?
Yeah, I'm just stealing power right now from the starter solenoid. You could do it from the fuse box or anywhere that has constant 12 volt. And then for the ground, I'm just going to put it on the engine block here. And then you're going to connect this bit, this clamp, over top of cylinder number 1's spark plug lead in the direction that it's stated. You can see it says plug with an arrow. So you want that facing the spark plug as close to the end of the plug as Jesus. So as you'll see, the gun is now firing a strobe light. This strobe is corresponding to when this spark plug is firing. So we're going to use this light to look down into the engine. And you'll see on the leftmost side of the pulley, there's a silver dot. I've used a silver Sharpie to highlight the dot to make it easier to see. You'll also see a gold line. I'll explain that later. That's for testing when we've got full advance. But for right now, we're just going to look at the silver dot on the left-hand side of the pulley and how it corresponds to the little fingers that come out from the engine side. So you can see on the leftmost side of the pulley, there's a small silver dot. And right now it looks like it's aligning to the second-most pointer that's on the engine side. If we start at the very top, the pointers correspond to 2-degree increments, meaning that the very top pointer is 0 degrees. The negative side of that pointer, the part that goes in, is 2. The next male part of the pointer is 4, and so on and so forth. So right now we're showing about 16 degrees before top dead center at idle. What we want to do is loosen the clamp that holds the distributor and rotate the distributor in order to get it to around 10 or 12 degrees. Now you're going to need a 7/16 wrench, and you're going to loosen off the distributor and spin it until you get looking down at about the 10 to 12 degree marker. If your idle is too high, then it's going to not show the correct number, so you want to make sure your idle is definitely at or below 1000 RPM. So you rotate the distributor clockwise to advance the timing or counterclockwise to retard the timing. So I've got it set at 10 degrees now, and that will be between the third and the fourth pointer, counting from the top. Alright, so with that we've set what's called the base timing. This is the timing when there's no mechanical advance being added by the distributor and the engine's running at around 900 to 1000 RPM at idle. The issue is, as you accelerate, as you do when you're normally driving, the distributor starts to add advance through its mechanical advance system, and it will have the spark plug come in sooner and sooner, meaning that at say 4000 RPM, the mechanical advance is fully maximized, and instead of sending the spark at 10 degrees, it'll be sending it at 30 degrees. Now the problem is, with our normal timing light, there are only 20-degree markers from 0 to 20 degrees on the engine. So if we want to see at 4000 RPM, somewhere in 30 to 34 degree range, we're going to have to make some new markers. Now you can either add teeth onto the bottom of the engine. However, with the engine in place, that's pretty hard to get to and pretty hard to fab up and have them be accurate. So instead, what we can do is on the pulley, where the little silver dot was that we were reading it off of, we can add another dot that's at, let's say, 20 degrees. So if we're reading off the 20 degree marker and we rev it up to 4000 RPM, and that 20 degree marker is now at 12 degrees, we know 20 plus 12 is 32, meaning that we've now viewing what it's doing at around 32 degrees. Now let me show you, because it'll be much simpler to actually explain it when you can see it right here on the engine. So right now I've got the engine rotated over so that the silver marker, the one that shows 0 degrees before top dead center, is lined up with the 20 degree marker. That's the furthest tooth down on the degree wheel on the side of the engine. So it's lined up there. Then what we're going to do is just take a Sharpie, and I've just taken a golden Sharpie in this time, and I've taped it onto a screwdriver so that I can reach it down to the engine, and I'm going to mark right next on the pulley, right next to the 0 degree top dead center marker. That's the very top one. So the silver dot, the one from the factory, is on the 20 degree marker, and looking at the same angle, I'm going to put a slash or a dot on the pulley next to the 0 degree top dead center marker. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fire up the engine, and with some safety glasses and earplugs, we're going to rev the engine up. You can either hold the throttle open, get a friend to sit in the car, or even just screw in the idle adjustment until it's reached full ignition advance, meaning that the mechanical advance has fully opened and you're getting all the possible advance that the distributor will give you. This is usually around 4000 RPM, so it's a very safe limit. Just set it at 4000 and then read off of the new line that you've drawn. Now you take that new line and you add 20 degrees to whatever the number you see next to the markers, because we've marked it at 20 degrees. And then from there you can see exactly what the timing is. And what we're going to do is we're going to aim for around 32 degrees total timing on these engines. Seem to be roughly around where they like to be. And the same process as before, you're going to spin the distributor clockwise or counterclockwise to get it to be at that point. So with the timing marked 20 degrees, engine warm, revving at around 4000 RPM, we're going to rotate the distributor so that our new mark lines up around the 12 degree marker. Let's do that now. Lock it down and make sure we've set the full advanced timing. We now know that at 4,000 RPM, or what they call all in, we've got 32 degrees before top dead center of timing. With that set, we're gonna fire the car up and let it idle and check what our timing is at now at idle. Chances are it'll be different than what it was when you set it to like 10 degrees. The thing is that max advance is much more critical to how the engine operates than the advance at timing or at idle. Essentially, if it runs all right when it's at idle, it's not overheating, it's not crazy advanced or crazy retarded, then it's probably fine. It's much more critical than when the car is at load, when you're giving it at 4,000 RPM, that the timing is correct. Because at load, there's much more potential for engine damage. Now, ideally, you'll have your distributor timed so that you have both at idle up through the RPM range, right to max advance, you have the correct timing. The only way to fully set this is to put the engine on a dyno and either have the springs or the weights changed in the distributor, or to have a fully electronic programmable ignition system where on a laptop you can set it to have specific timing rates depending on both engine RPM and engine load through manifold vacuum or whatnot. But for our purposes, we're essentially going to be setting it at around 32 degrees max advance. And then we're going to be checking what it's at idle to verify that it's within the acceptable range. So now with everything set the way it is, the distributor's locked down so that it's set at 32 degrees. We're going to fire up the engine, have the idle again, 900 to 1,000 RPM, and with the timing light, we're just going to verify and see what our timing is at idle. We're at about 16 degrees, so we're at what we originally started at, around 16 degrees before top dead center at idle at 900 RPM with the vacuum vents disconnected. Now for our purposes, that amount of ignition timing is very acceptable for this sort of engine. We've got a very early take up on the distributor, so we're getting full advance. It seems to be around 3,000 RPM. It seems to work for our application. So as long as you're within an acceptable range and the car is idling correctly, you should be good to go. So now we can unplug all of this stuff, reconnect the vacuum advance to the distributor, and we'll go out for a test drive and we'll do the final step of setting the timing. We're going to bring our wrench to loosen the distributor, our screwdriver to adjust the idle, and our timing light to check the timing. So we've got the engine running right now. We've got our engine temperature is a little bit above 80 degrees Celsius. We're warmed up, got good oil pressure. And essentially what we're going to be doing now is checking for pinging or pinking. What that is like very small amounts of sort of detonation that's happening before the spark plug is firing. Essentially what we want to do is load up the engine, and we're going to do this by sort of lugging the engine. Right now I've got it in 4th gear. We're going to either go up a hill and go full throttle or high level of throttle in 4th gear, or in our case we don't have a hill around here, so I'm just going to put on the e-brake and I'm going to accelerate in 4th gear, and we're going to be listening to the engine. And what pinging sounds like is kind of like rocks in a tin can. There'll be a rattle sound from the engine. If we hear a rattle sound from the engine, it means we have too much ignition advance. So if we're at 32 degrees, what we're going to do is pull over, and we don't need to rev it out to the max amount. All we need to do is check the ignition timing at idle, say it's 12 degrees, and we're going to retard the timing by 2-point increments. So if it's at 12 degrees, we'll retard it to 10 degrees, and then we'll go for a drive again. pulling the e-brake and accelerating in high gear, loading up the engine. And we're going to do this until there is no pinging sound from the engine. Now, if you set it to 32 degrees and you go for a drive and you load up the engine and you don't hear anything, I would say just leave it at that. The chances of making more power, having more efficiency by setting it higher than 32 degrees is very slight. You want to be on the safe side of things, because if you do have pinging in the engine, it is can be a little dangerous for the engine, and you really want to avoid having any of that. So what I'm going to do is just find a long straight road here, get it up into 4th gear, do a semi or full throttle application with the e-brake pulling up to really load up the engine to simulate us going up a big hill or something, and we're just going to listen to the engine. About 2,500 RPM. I'm going to apply the e-brake and give it full throttle. E-brake applied, full throttle, lug in the engine. You listen, there's no rattle sound. Now we'll try it a little bit higher RPM. 2,500 RPM, pull the e-brake, load the engine. So we are going to try both retarding the timing and advancing the timing for demonstration purposes. So hopefully we can have an audible difference between the two, so that everyone can see what it sounds like. So I set it 2 degrees more retarded than it previously was. So we'll see what that sounds like, if there's any difference in power, and then we'll try it the other way. Same thing, get up to 4th gear. Pretty much the same to me. Okay, so 2,500, e-brake.
It's quiet. It's not that much, but I do hear.
Yeah, I hear a little bit there. So we'll set it back to 32, which is usually around where these engines like to run. They're quite efficient in terms of the combustion chamber. So a lot of times 32 degrees is about the most you're going to find. Quite often on a dyno, you won't be making any more power at 32 than say 30. It depends. It's really hard to tell, but essentially you just want to make sure that you're in a safe operating range. And if it's hitting 32 and it's not making any weird noises, then that's usually probably whereabouts you want to leave it. All right, so there you have it. You've set the timing on your car. It should run amazing now. Now the final thing, we've done mechanical, now we've done the timing. The third and final step will be carb tuning. That'll be the next video. Check it out. Bonus tip. So say you've taken all the spark plug wires and cap and rotor off and you're confused how this goes together. Well, here's a little diagram for you. So whenever we're talking about cylinder number 1, it's the one nearest to the fan, followed by 2, 3, 4. And the way that the distributor rotates is counterclockwise. 1, 3, 4, 2. Spark plug leads like this. If you're having trouble and the engine isn't running right despite setting all the timing and doing all the adjustments that we went through today, make sure that it's in the correct order, because sometimes you can have them mixed around, the car will still run, but it will not run well. So this is very important.